Hello and welcome to the FX Podcast. I'm John Montgomery. Our guest for the podcast this week is Christopher Townsend, overall visual effects supervisor for Loki Season 2. Before we get to the podcast, I just want to mention we're trying something a bit different for this ep. For those of you who've signed up for our new article email notifications, basically you get emailed whenever we release new content, you'll have received an email with a link to a video recording of this podcast, which also includes footage from the show. For those of you who haven't signed up for the notifications, it's super easy to do. Just click on an article or podcast on the FX Guide homepage. Then on the article, scroll down on the right to the section that says Get Email Updates whenever new articles are posted. Enter your email address and you're good to go. So let's go ahead and cross over the podcast as Mike chats with Christopher Townsend.
Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
This is a amazing production. I guess if I could just start with a perspective on Loki 2, because you've done so many big visual effects films and in the sort of similar space, I guess, in terms of aesthetics and quality of imagery. How does a series like this compare to you doing a feature?
Well, I was a fan of the first show, and to be honest, I was nervous about going into streaming.
Really?
I had obviously done a lot of features, and that was where I was sort of comfortable. And I was thinking, how is it going to be different? And remarkably, it's not that much different. At least the way we did it on this show. We still went to the same sets of vendors who did the same quality of work. And we had a very collaborative team on our end in terms of the creatives, the directors, production designer, costume, stunts, everyone, special effects, DP, everyone was just so incredibly collaborative and had an executive producer in Kevin Wright who had a very, very clear vision of what the show needed to be. And so I think it was coming into it as a sequel, as it were, was interesting because we had a lot of good stuff that we could stand on the shoulders of, and I think that made it that much easier. But the fact that it was streaming rather than a feature, it didn't really change that much. It meant that we had 6 deliveries effectively of the 6 different episodes. So we had 6 different final dates. But that's a little bit similar to when you close a reel in feature films in the same way. So it wasn't really that much different, but it was long form storytelling, which allowed everything to breathe a little bit more. And I really enjoyed that. I had a great time. It was a really good experience all around.
Let's go through the roster of companies on it. I have, in no particular order, like Framestore, ILM, Rising Sun, Fuse, Trickster. Maybe I missed a few. Cantina Creative. Yeah, so that's a sort of a roster of a sort of a typical type of set of great companies that you might have on a feature. So I guess in that respect, it's kind of similar. But does it change with the episodic nature how you farm that out? Because clearly some things are going to have to come in before others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you still try to play to each individual company's strength. So we went to RSP for animation and they did Miss Minutes primarily. And we went to ILM to do some big environment work with Chicago and the World's Fair in episode 3 and a little bit of other things scattered around. We went to Fuse Effects to do lots of sort of the little bits of things. They did the time doors and they did some deletion effects. And then they did a whole slew of work. They did the whole McDonald's environment, beautifully done. We went to Trickster to do the world of everything to do with the loom, or almost everything to do with the loom and spaghettification and of the loom, or not of the loom, but of the characters when they walked out on the gangway, and everything that we saw throughout, and also the Citadel work. And we went to Framestore to do the time slipping and the majority of the spaghettification, and particularly the end, the end of the finale at the end on episode 6. And Cantina handled our graphics as they often do for us, and did a beautiful job. And Lola did a few face things for us, just a little bit. I think that's everybody that I gone
Let's
through.
discuss some of those visual effects, because some of them are marvelous and I take nothing away from them. And the environment work, for example. But I guess I'm super intrigued by some of the very original effects that you had to do. I was going to hit on two of them: the spaghettification and the time slipping. In particular, I'm kind of wondering what you'd had on set for the spaghettification. That's a effect that inherently involves live action, but like it's not like you can put a tennis ball on a rod and say, "Hey, look here," when the entire world is kind of changing around. How did you approach that?
But it's interesting. Obviously, there's never one solution to the problem. You always go in and try and figure it out on the day, which is always the thing that makes it so interesting from my perspective. Uh, but the spaghettification particularly was an effect which was one of the things that the directors really wanted in Aaron and Justin. They wanted everything to feel very tangible and very real and something very physical that you physically could touch. At least it felt like you could touch it. And it's only until episode 6 that we see that where Loki is actually able to grab some of the timelines. But up until that point, he's tried to grab things and touch, and he can't, and it's all beyond his control. But he wanted to make it feel very physical, and so we looked at a lot of different reference of things that are spaghetti-like, including spaghetti, but strings and strands and anything that almost. We talked a lot about like Play-Doh, of it being extruded through and that sort of feeling of things just coming out, and that's the kind of feel we wanted. But trying to find something which was elegant and simple in its conceit, but then had a lot of complexity to the way it actually evolved, and the way the surface breaks up at the very beginning. There's one sequence in episode 5 with what we call the record store, where we see the record store sort of collapsing around Lyle, the store owner, and then eventually Sylvie. And that was something which was probably our sort of big spaghettification moment, as it were. And it was one of the earliest ones that we really started working on trying to figure out what that look was. But in terms of what you had on set, a lot of it was you'd shoot on a practical set, and then you would have to at the point of spaghettification, you then transition to a full digital set. We would scan the entire worlds that they were standing in, and then scan individual pieces as well and photograph everything. Clear Angle was our company in London that was doing the scanning work for us and did a beautiful job. And they would we would just basically just gather as much data as we could. We had witness cameras everywhere while shooting in the usual sort of traditional way. And then it was just a lot of art and craft of trying to make it look as real, physical, and tangible, and as beautiful as possible.
To that end, it seems to me that the colors and the nature of, I don't know, the way that you rendered the spaghetti was actually deceptively simple. I mean, it worked really well, but of course it could be just visually completely confusing because you can't tell what you're looking at. You have to kind of isolate that there is a strand, but by the same token, you don't want to just have it like it's a digital effect where it's pixelating the background. And yet if you just pull all the colors from the background, you can't see what the hell's going on. I was just wondering, how long did it take to kind of find that readability from a visual design point of view?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was lighting, creating more dramatic lighting where possible so that we could motivate shade, light and dark areas, which would give form to these things so you could pick them out as individual strands. And like you say, you didn't want it to look like someone vomited on screen, that you had every color possible. You had to be very elegant with the sort of solution to keep it sort of in keeping with the general aesthetics of the show. It was a pretty muted color palette throughout in the show, relatively at most of the time. But in the record store, there were obviously different album covers that all had different, the different colors, and it was trying to pick up each color from and extrude literally. And Framestore was created systems where they were taking the pixel value and then extruding that and then using that as the base color, which they then lit and they then lit it and rendered it in a way that gave it physicality. So it was a lot of back and forth. I mean, a lot of work that they put into it, just to try and keep it looking elegant and readable, like you say, but also relevant to the environment from which it was coming.
Yeah, and as great as the 3D would have been in that, there's also the problem of like, how do you comp something into a scene so it looks like it's in the scene when it's actually destroying the inherent lighting and nature of the scene that would be in otherwise lighting it, if
Yes.
that makes sense?
So often if you notice certain shots, the lighting is the last thing conveniently to go. So we would use the overhead lights and hold on to them for as long as possible before it would just go dark. And then there becomes that magical ambient. Where's the light coming from? And my answer always is the same place as the music. It's just movie magic. And
it's emotionally valid.
It's emotionally, yeah, exactly. So I think it's always a fine balance. And I think, as I said, one of the interesting things about the show is every single shot was different and offered up different challenges, which made it interesting.
So, I mean, I don't normally like to discuss the stars and the actors because we're not that kind of a, focus. But in this case, I'm really interested in how you communicated with the actors, what the heck was going on, because I mean, having seen it, I understand it. But if you were trying to explain that to somebody, you could be like, as an actor, you could be like, I'm completely unaware how I should respond to this environment. Did they have a visualization, or did you have to workshop with them on how you wanted them to be?
We did have, yeah, we had done some tests. We'd done some early tests to give us an idea. And we often on set, often I will go up to the actors and, with the director say, okay, so this is what's going to happen. Something like this. This is what you're doing. And then the directors will be, so therefore emotionally, you're probably in this space and this space, and this is where you probably want to be. I think Tom particularly was very aware of what was going on. He was very integral to the process, the creative process. He was one of our executive producers on the show, and he obviously has a very big voice in the aesthetics and the look and the feel and the tone of the show, as well as the story. And so he was very aware of stuff as we were doing it, and we would be working with him and showing him stuff. But the other actors, Sophie and the actor that played Lyle, the record store owner, we would talk to them, and we prevised it heavily as well. So that was the other thing. We had really good previs that, in that case, Frame Store and the record store had done. And we were able to show them pretty much shot for shot. This is what's going to happen. This is the camera. This is where it's going to be. And the record store was probably the most tightly prevised sequence that we did in the entire show. And so we knew exactly, because we want it to feel very artful and to just quite luxurious in its sort of, visual feel, and wanted to spend some time in there. So we also had the benefit of previous that we could show, and and obviously an actor looks and goes, "What the heck?" No.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we care about the actors for like what they're communicating, and it's a fine line because I mean, you could easily fall into a grotesque horror kind of thing, or a sort of a cyborgy kind of it means nothing kind of digital thing. So, which I guess kind of segues to the same thing you had to do over the time slipping stuff, because here again, the role of the actor, and let's use Tom as an example, like his performance is integral to that effect working, but they have to have a good understanding what the heck they're doing. Was that again did you understand that time slipping model really well at the point that you were filming it, or was it still in development in terms of how much things were going to be bent and stretched? And
yeah, we were sort of 50% there by the time we started shooting, but we knew kind of sort of what it was we were after. Again, Framestore took the lead on did all the time slipping. They shared the spaghettification stuff with Trickster, but they took the lead on. They did all the time slipping shots of Tom, and there was we use a lot of reference of Francis Bacon portraits and cubism and long exposure photography, all this kind of stuff to try and use as reference. And again, trying to create something tangible and physical was really important. We wanted to also use the strings, so it feels like there's almost a taffy-like feeling as he's being stretched through time and pulled. And so once we had some pretty good concept art and some concept sort of animations from Framestore, we took that, or some ideas that was just based on some some old footage and things. We then went to Tom, and in early photography, we had him, just took him aside and said, okay, we're going to do this particular test. Can we get you to shoot this? And and we discussed and talked about it a lot. And we came up with sort of we shot a whole bunch of different things. We took that back to Framestore. They continued to work on it. So by the time we got to actually shooting those sequences, we already had pretty much established what it was going to be. We were able to show Tom. And then on a shot by shot basis, it was a matter of trying to figure out what particular things that we wanted to try and shoot, whether it was, he was in pain, or he was coming into the sequence, or he's going out of the sequence, or he was surprised, or is it a very three-dimensional moment with him lunging at camera, or is it something where it's more laid back, and is he sucked back? And he was amazing. I mean, the guy just went from bang, and the directors would finish with the scene and say, "Okay, Chris, it's up to you." We'd say, "Okay, Tom, come on back," and he'd step back on, and we'd try and wheel if we had time, we'd wheel a 6x6 or an 8x8 green screen behind him just to try and get something. And we would then say, "Okay," and I would say, "Okay, give me so-and-so this." And we would just went through 10, 12, 15 different.
Because that's the thing I was really curious about, whether you basically said, "Hey, give us 15 different emotions."
Yes.
And then you just or you said, "We specifically want pain, angst, fear."
We did both. There were elements where we knew that, well, this is him, this is the point where he's beginning to understand what time slipping is, therefore he's more controlled. So give us a more controlled, motivated performance. And then this is just absolute, utter gore. I mean, this is, you are being ripped, and it is really painful. And obviously in episode 1, he says it's like being, I think Mobius says it's like being born, and it looks like you're being born and killed all at the same time or something. And it's that beautifully gruesome thing that we also wanted to lean into. We wanted to make it feel like a really painful thing for Loki. It's not something he has any control of, so that it would allow us to take him to that place where he does have the control at the very end in episode, I think 5 and 6, where you see that he has that control.
I'm going to come back to the control in 1 second, but before I do that, when I first saw it, I thought, "Oh, this is some really high-level compositing." But then when I sort of got a chance to stop frame through it, because I was just enjoying it when I first saw it. I just liked the show. But, if you can make yourself stop enjoying the show and start looking at it. And I went, hang on a second, This isn't 2D, this is 3D. Because there's actually these kind of stretching, like a limb goes from one position to another with almost like tendrils of connected stretch, which made me think, how much of him is a digital double through that? And is his face live? Is it the whole body live? Is it just is there any rule of thumb there?
I think it was a combination of all of that. Yes, to all of that.
Right.
It was always based on the photographic element. So he would always perform it. We would one of the biggest challenges with the time slipping was how do you create it so that you can do it over and over again? And there's 50, 60 shots of time slipping in the show. There's a lot of it. And it's not just but each one is a bespoke one-off. And how do you actually physically do that and it's a very complicated thing. So the methodology was that we would have editorial, we would shoot 10, 12, 15 different passes of Tom. That was then handed to editorial. And editorial, when they were cutting the sequence, would go and look at those 15 takes and say, "Okay, well, we want a bit of this and a bit of this and a bit of this." And they would then take those and they would just cut those together with 3, 4, 6 different performances and just try and get the basic timing to give us the feel. That was then handed to, and once that the directors had looked at that and said, "Yeah, that's pretty good," we then handed that to Framestore. Framestore then, and we also handed them all 15 takes and said, "Okay, here are the 6 that we think are working, but have a play with it and see what you think." They would use that, and they would either come back with exactly the same timing and the same performances, or often they would come back with slightly different performances, and they would cut it together and comp it a little bit nicer, and they would cut it, roll them out, and they would just very, very simply put it together, but as a 2D thing. That was then sent back to editorial. We looked at it. Editorial then got the stamp of, "Yep, we like it. It still works." It would go back to Framestore. Framestore would then say, "Okay, now we're going to start tracking and modeling," and they would do a full, CG track on Tom. They created a really great digital double, and they then tracked in the digi double to match the performance, and then they used that to drive simulations of the taffy-like string-like structure. And once we got all that together, sort of part the way through that, once they sort of assembled it, which was a very time-consuming thing, they would then send that back to us and say, okay, we're now at the next stage, which we have it all 3D, and we think this is just more of a here you go, just a FYI, this is what it looks like. Usually we were like, great, that was good, keep going. And they would then start, lighting it, rendering it, and then compositing it. And then once we got to a relatively clean comp, we would then show that to the directors and say, okay, here it is. Most of the time, the directors and the execs and the creator and the producers would look at it and say, that's great, looks really good. Occasionally they'd say, we want a bit more gore here, or can we stretch this, or it's too cutty, we need to. So occasionally there were kickbacks where we'd have to go back to step one, but usually that process and that sort of system worked really, really well. But it was a matter of, fine tuning the comp and getting the comp down. And then on top of that, going back in and doing hand paint work on individual frames to create a drooping jaw or a popping eyeball or something just for a few frames. And that was all done just hand work on, individual frames to, at the very, very end, to try and add that level of gruesomeness or reality as needed.
It's a sequence that shows that someone like Tom has a lot of stage physicality control over his body, because it effectively pops from pose to pose, and those poses, that's snapping between. I mean, obviously he's not doing that snapping. It has to be visual effects to connect random angle of Tom to random angle of Tom. But the poses in a classical animation sense are very complete. Like he arrives at a point where we as the audience can kind of like read him.
Yes.
And it's not a blurred kind of muffled thing.
Yes.
So it's a very effective technique. You must have been pretty happy with it.
We were, and it was great. And we worked a lot with Tom of creating the silhouettes, as you said, about having it so that there was a very sharp silhouette that you could hold on. And he was phenomenal. I mean, he just gave it. And, and if he said, okay, I think you've got it all. I'd say, can you give me one more that comes lunging towards camera, or give me more pain, or hold it and shake and vibrate your face on that moment. He's like, absolutely, yep, okay, anything else? Anything, and he was just amazing to work with, like so committed to the process. And he knew obviously that time slipping was a pretty integral thing to the entire show. So it was very important.
So now I want to get back to that point you were talking about with control and the fact that these are not generic. These are, cluing in us as the audience to the subtext of where he is in his journey. I mean, this show is incredibly interesting because it jumps around in time. But from a production point of view, I'm kind of fascinated how the heck you kept it in your head, because like clearly when you shoot, you don't shoot in chronological order, I presume. And so you're having to like, if you're at one location, you're going to shoot the bit for episode 1 and episode 3 kind of thing, but also where he is in his journey and where you are with your visual effects. Like it works consistently for us as the audience now, but of course it's the most fractured of narratives. Was it like
was incredibly challenging? We had a Alison Paul was our producer, our visual effects producer, and she was quite phenomenal. And she was my logic person that I would often like, where are we at now? Which one are we at? Like this is early, this is late, this is in the middle, this is so that was really useful to have someone else as a sounding board that sort of could keep track of things a little bit better than I could. But obviously the way it's written, Eric Martin, the key writer on the show, and the producers and the director, everyone was very in tune with, okay, this is, it was it wasn't shot in a shambles. It was very specific and curated as a process of how we shot, and saying, okay, we're now at this stage. So costume has to be here and makeup has to be this. And the environment out the window is now this. And now he's doing this. And, and then I remember we have to come back to it for in 3 episodes time. We're coming back to it when it's actually before this moment. There's a time when he walks into the into one of the rooms, and then we see the same scene again, but from 10 seconds earlier. And it was, okay, what's on the monitor? And what does Cantina put on the monitor to tell the story that we're slightly before we get to the next point, which we've already seen. So it was a very complicated show to put together, but yeah, in the end, I think we're all very, very happy with it.
Yeah, no, it works exceptionally well, but I mean, I can't imagine what it was like just keeping track of that. I mean, I don't think
Yeah.
producers get enough credit at the best of times, right?
Oh,
But this must have been like just to par excellence on just tracking assets.
yeah.
Yeah. Hey, so let's talk about the loom, the whole visualization at the end sequence. This is kind of like fascinating to me. It's a visual effects problem. It's a 3D rendering problem, but it's also like a data visualization problem in a sense. We, the audience, have to have some idea what the hell's going on with an incredibly abstract concept that is inherently so difficult that most of the characters in the show don't understand it. Um, Again, it works brilliantly, but I mean, how hard was it to find the visual language so that it wasn't just, hey, I don't understand what's going on here. Just tell me when this is over so I can get back to the story kind of problem? Because that
Yeah.
didn't happen, but it can happen.
Absolutely. And we were very, very aware of that. It was very difficult. It was one of the hardest things is creating the loom and what that loom environment means, what it's doing, trying to add logic where there really isn't much, trying to tie it into the first season so that it still feels like, what we've seen out, when we were in the Citadel at the end of He Who Remains at the end of time, we see this blue and purple sort of glowy world out there of timelines changing and branching out and things. And we've already established that. So we've got to lean into that as well. We can't just ignore it, even though we want to create a more tangible thing than that. So it was certainly a huge challenge. Trickster did the vast majority of the shots of the loom, and they created some beautiful concept art based on original art from Marvel. And they built this. One of the big challenges was how big is it, and is it? We'd always talked about it being galactic sized, this enormous thing, because it's weaving time itself is the idea, and it's weaving it into a singular timeline, into the sacred timeline. And trying to always figure out the logic of, well, where was the Citadel in the first season, and where does that relate to what we see in this one, and all this kind of stuff. And so it does actually almost logically track what where it all works. But our idea was that what the loom is doing is it's literally weaving time, and it takes all time. It weaves it into a singular timeline that as time then progresses around the TVA, it begins to sort of fray and branch. The TVA are there to try and trim it, and then it comes all the way back. And as it's branching, it's going to the purples and blues, and then it comes around the other side. And it's by that point, it's got pretty crazy. And then the loom's job is to grab it all, separate it all into its individual components, i.e., individual colors, and then drag it back in through the loom and create the singular timeline. And that's sort of the general logic, right? So once you've sort of trying to figure out that's several months worth of work just to try and get to that point. It's then the visualization of what that thing is. And again, we'd said we wanted it to be galactic in scale, and that there will be nothing else between. We're in a void. There's nothing. There's a nothingness, is what we kept calling it, between the TVA and this thing out there. And we realized that if it's galactic in scale and there's nothing, then it just looks like a matte painting, and it's such an abstract thing anyway. So then you start introducing volumetric things, and we make it a bit smaller, so it's a bit closer, so it has a little bit more human scale to it, even though it's huge.
Sure.
But I think we ended up saying it's the size of Central Park. That was our sort of visualization. That's how big this thing is, right? But we played around with sort of trying to fill the volume and fill the space between us and it from the TVA out to the loom. And we had these wisps of energy that we'd called temporal energy, that was just so much energy coming off this loom that it created these wisps of energy that you saw that helped describe the volume in the same way that snow does, or dust, or in the air. And then we also wanted to lean into something that the DP and the directors had really sort of gone on about a lot, was this rainbow colored light on people's faces. And they did a lot of these or a little bit of this rainbow colored light on the sets and everything else. And we tried to find a way to motivate that. And so we ended up with these what we call these prismatic flares, which would sort of be where this temporal energy would get so intense that it would create these flares. And if it hit you or hit something, it would begin to sort of rip that to pieces. And that's what would then drive the spaghettification and the disintegration of the suits of anyone that was walking out there. So again, it was all trying to find, you're sort of building, it's that whole thing of you're building the train tracks as the train is going. You're sort of trying to figure it out, and it was a really fun process, but it was a bit stressful because you're sort of thinking this has to work, this has to make sense, and it has to be visually interesting enough that we keep coming back to this world, and there should be enough in the animation of what Trickster's doing with how the loom is reacting and acting that it's kind of it has to be a backstory thing, that it's just sort of there in the background, but it also has to be something which, if an audience member says, what is happening out there, that it makes sense. So there was a lot of effort was put into what that loom is doing. And then at the end, sorry,
I was going to say, well, it's just in terms of like doing this though, like it sounds like facing away from the TVA, it could be just entirely animation. Though obviously inside the TVA, you've got the actors kind of looking out the windows.
It is.
Well, I guess starting with the actors for a second, did you have any kind of LED screens or contact lighting or stuff to give us, because they're clearly not looking at that, they're looking at a soundstage.
Well, they're looking at big old bright lights, unfortunately, because we needed to be able to pump enough light in. But again, we showed them concept art of this is what the loom looks like. And they're like, oh, cool.
Okay.
But
so
it's this thing that's way out there.
And they're inside, and that's obviously great there's a lot of sequences there when it keeps on coming back through time. But once you get through they're in a suit, for example, right? Whoever's going through is in a suit. So that seems to me like you could pretty much just go fully digital and basically becomes an animated sequence. Is that then, what you did based on previs, or was it like just, I was just interested in that process.
Yeah, it was very heavily based on previs. Third floor previs, a lot of those sequences out on the gangway. And then we shot it. And one of the things that we ended up saying was that initially we shot it with when we shot the episode 1 stuff with Mobius in the suit. We put him in the suit and we had him, walking out there. We had a bungee attached to him to drag him back so that made it look like he was walking against an incredible wind. We had wind machines as well, and we had we shot it at 40 frames. I think it was 40 frames a second. So we just shot just a little bit faster so that it was a little bit, so we had that slightly slow motion feel, but we didn't want it to feel quite like an astronaut, but it was kind of like an astronaut. And he didn't have a tube on the back. But he had this massive suit on, and it was really uncomfortable and difficult and challenging. And then we went to Trickster and said, okay, when these prismatic flares hit him, we want the suit to start disintegrating. So we had 2 different versions of the suit. We had the beginning and the end, as it were. And at some point, it's a transition. And so they created this beautiful digi-double version of the suit. But then they tracked on patches because then we felt that was the most successful way. So the first episode 1 is primarily a practical suited Mobius walking out. We put a CG visor on, and then we put a CG tube, and we had a little portion of the gangway, but we then created full CG environments of everything else, and everything else obviously is CG. So that was the sort of the process, all shot against a blue screen with big bright lights and lots of wind. When it came to Timely getting in the suit in episode 4, at that point, we'd sort of done enough of those shots that and the model, the CG model that Trickster had built was so beautiful that it was like, you know what, I think we can just go CG. So a lot of it is full CG with Timely's face, sort of placed in there. So it's not so it's actually his performance and everything else, but it's driven by his performance. So we still shot him. And everything about the way he moved, it was exactly the same, and we match animated to that. But a lot of the, not all of the shots, but a lot of the shots end up being full digital in terms of the suit. And then we kept just little portions of the set because he was interacting with those. So again, it was a lot of sort of shot by shot how you deal with it. But we realized, because there was even more destruction on the second one, that you were destroying something that was really photographed, and it didn't really make sense. So we went digital. Having said that, I think it was really good that I wouldn't have changed it. I think we would have done the same technique, i.e. shooting our actor and putting him in a suit, because it gave us a real believable physical performance that drove our animation. So it doesn't look just like a guy in a CG suit. Hopefully, even
No,
though
it works really well. In fact, it's to get to your earlier point, it's the culmination of the series, and I would say both at a personal level and just generally around the internet, an incredibly fulfilling finish to that sequence. Like it had to have a conclusion because it had been so chaotic, because it had been so interesting. We needed a resolution that felt satisfying, and the whole sequence provided that in that last episode, which is kind of remarkable because, as I say, it could have been just so confusing by that point that the audience gave up. So to get that visual clarity that in your storytelling is a huge achievement, I think.
Yeah, I think, and that was actually, so Trickster had done almost all of the Loom stuff right up until the end of episode 6, which is the time that Loki takes on this mantle and it becomes, takes on this burden, as it were, and walks out. And that's when Framestore then took on that. And Framestore did that whole final sequence as he climbs the stairs, goes through the portal, climbs the stairs, and sits in the throne, and then you have the Idrisil, the massive pullback shot, and it was a big gamble. I mean, that sequence was something that we felt that the directors and the producer Kevin Wright really wanted, and so we prevised it a lot with Framestore. I did a lot of sort of very rough concept art, just trying to figure out what does this kind of sort of look like, and how clear do we show the tree at the end if it's supposed to be sort of reminiscent of Thor 1 and Idrisil that we've seen there, and then the other renditions of Idrisil that we've seen throughout on Captain America 1, and we've seen the tree in various forms throughout. And so trying to find a way to create something which feels mythical and grand enough to sort of hold, to be a really nice, like, full stop, period, done, so like, and scene. We wanted to really feel like it was like, it was done, and create a beautiful, elegant, massive shot. But the whole sequence is that's Tom climbing up a blue staircase with wind against him. He's ultimately, we did tests where he's holding onto ropes and pool noodles and all sorts of things to give us that physicality. But a lot of the stuff was ultimately just mime and him miming the strain. Amazing performance that would then, we cut him out of that and we built a whole world around him of these strands of time that he was ultimately able to grab. So it was tricky because it was such a visual effects heavy moment, but we felt that it was well earned over the course of the 2 seasons, that it was Absolutely. Like, and okay, now we can have this moment. We've earned this. So,
well, we're out of time, but I mean, I could talk to you about this all day long because I think it's just great work. And as I say, it's this tightrope of incredibly great visuals, but not losing us in terms of the story that I think is one of the really impressive aspects. But I thank you so much for taking time out to talk to us. And congratulations. Spectacularly good work.
Thanks very much. Really appreciate it. It's always great to work with a great team. So really, really grateful to everyone.
Thanks so much, Christopher, for taking the time to chat with us. I really appreciate it. Before we close out, I just want to mention we've updated the website to highlight articles from the archives of our 25 years at Effects Guide. They run the gamut from the very cool Art of series to shorter articles covering things such as software that's come and gone, like Toxic and Shake, or even software that never came out, like Socrato. So head on over to FX Guide to check it out. Well, that's it for this episode of the FX Podcast. For Mike Seymour, I'm John Montgomery. Thanks for listening and watching.